Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Grung, Week in Review. I'm Asbed Bedrosyan, and together with Alan Zamanyan, this week we're going to talk about the following major topics. Another constitutional amendment, opposition rising, new bottle, old wine, Iran's Foreign Minister Zarif on a tour de six, state of the virus, and Armenia Fund used to shore up the Dram.
To talk about these issues, we have with us Asbed 𝐀𝐬𝐿, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at the American University of Armenia, and Hrant Mikhailyan, a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He is also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hello, Alan. Hello, Hrant. Hello, Asbed.
Hello.
On Tuesday, MyStep MPs started discussing potential constitutional amendments that would facilitate for the ruling bloc to dissolve parliament in order to pave the way for fresh parliamentary elections. Under the current constitution, snap elections are only possible if the prime minister resigns and parliament fails to elect a new PM after 2 attempts. Pashinyan has agreed to resign only if parliament will agree to not nominate a new PM and lead to fresh elections. Both opposition parties in the parliament, Բարգավաճ Հայաստան and Լուսավոր Հայաստան, have refused to cooperate, but the ruling bloc controls enough votes to prevent any nominations. Hrant, on the surface, it looks like Pashinyan and his ruling bloc can force their plan through. So what's the issue that would necessitate a constitutional amendment?
Pashinyan is afraid that his party might get out of his control if he lets them to vote freely. If he resigns and twice will not be elected, then he is afraid that his party might elect someone else. In reality, the chance is very low because they still have, if I'm not mistaken, 84 out of 132 places in the parliament. But still, he's afraid of consequences.
Asbed, as an aside to the specific instance of constitutional amendment, can you take a moment and discuss the constant tendency by successive Armenian leaderships changing the constitution to create short-term tactical advantages for themselves?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the major challenges of any constitution. You can have the best constitution, but then whoever is in power at the time, they can always accommodate the constitution to serve their own purposes. So we've seen this, as you mentioned before, in the case of Armenia, 2 major constitutional changes, actually 10-year increments, one after 10 years from the original one, 1995 to 2005, then the 2015 amendments. And as much as it's presented as being, strengthening the constitution, obviously there are elements there to keep the ruling parties, whoever they are, staying in power. This raises a major challenge for any constitution, a major question as well. If you look around the world, there are constitutions which are rigid and there are ones that are flexible. And the rigidity and the flexibility is a factor of how easy it is to change it. Going as far as, for instance, demanding a constitutional referendum for every minor change, to just having simple majority decisions by the parliament, or a supermajority, as defined by 2/3 majority. We've seen this how can be utilized. Like, for instance, Hungary in recent years, Viktor Orban managed to change the constitution accordingly. In the case of Armenia, major constitutional reforms require a referendum, but there are also elements of non-major constitutional amendments or changes that can be conducted with just the limitation of a parliamentary majority or supermajority. So this is a problem not unique to Armenia, but it is accentuated, especially now, with the prevailing political environment in Armenia. The challenge remains to what extent the constitution can become a document that is stable, that is a guideline, but at the same time defines parameters without everyone coming in and changing it at a whim. By the way, I do like to mention that there are a lot of countries, there's at least a few countries in the world that do not have a written constitution, yet they are quite well functioning and stable. The UK being one, Israel is another. If you go to any of these countries and ask to see their constitution, they say we don't have one. It's the acts of parliament that over a period of time has constituted the body that we know as constitution. So this is old news, not new news, and politicians and legislatures learn, they find loopholes to make changes here and there, and this is within that context that one has to consider. And as Hrant mentioned, just one more thing is the but of the year, especially Nikol Pashinyan, to have a a palace coup, let's call it, within his ruling party. That's why he wants to make sure that the elections would happen without actually giving an opportunity for someone else to get elected.
Is there anything that can be done to better protect the Constitution so that it can stand above any future single political party or majority and requires a truly democratic coalition of forces reflecting broad citizen support?
Well, I have a very short note on that. In last years, Armenian government, when it wanted to change the constitution, it would appeal to the Venice Commission. Overall, Venice Commission's recommendations were useful, but sometimes it would accept something which would be acceptable under overall logic, but it would not be truly democratic because Armenian government knew how to communicate with Venice Commission, let's say. They knew how to present what they are doing as a democratic move, as more progressive move, and so on. This has been done by previous government and by this government as well. Now, to prevent the concentration of power, I think it's best thing to have is to involve as many as possible players, I mean political parties, which would be in the maybe joint commission on constitutional amendments, and also expert communities, which would be comprised by different sides. I think that would let Armenia prevent the situations like this when the constitution which was accepted does not serve a whole political spectrum and it more serves specific party or just the authorities.
I just want to add on what Haran said. I mean, the Venice Commission is a player when it comes to constitutional amendments, and as someone who has worked in legislative reforms and in Armenia, I could always hear that, okay, this is going to be sent to the Venice Commission, but their recommendations are just that, recommendations. And even in previous governments, Haran is correct, the way they would present the constitutional amendments, even if it was a pretext to make it look like more democracy in Armenia, but then even the ruling of Venice Commission are sometimes so vague that you can see people opposing the amendments, would have an interpretation, and the ruling or the proposed party would have another interpretation. And, the other component here is about guaranteeing electoral integrity, because according to our Armenian constitution, a constitutional referendum can only pass if it receives 50% plus one of the participants or the voter turnout. Granted, that would also mean overall 25% of the overall electorate. In other words, to simplify it, there has to be at least 50% voter turnout, of which 50% plus one actually votes for it, making it 25%. So in the past, I remember, especially in the 2005 constitutional referendum, they could barely bring it up to that percentage. And obviously there were concerns about electoral irregularities, busing, and so on and so forth. But definitely Dan's point of include more stakeholders is important, be that during the drafting period, but also in terms of the legislative process, in terms of including extra parliamentary forces, experts, and so on.
Turning our attention to the opposition demands for the resignation of the PM and for snap elections to install a transitional government to lead to fresh elections. Over the past 2 months, we've talked many times on this show about the ineffectiveness of the opposition to achieve its goals. This past week, 𝐀𝐬𝐻 𝐊𝐴 promised new tactics to achieve their goals, and 𝐁𝐵 𝐀𝐬𝐿 said that if constitutional and legal methods fail to achieve results, the opposition would initiate an uprising. A similar assessment was made by former President Robert Kocayan in his interview on Wednesday. Haran, can you talk a little bit about where the opposition is stuck and what are their options?
I think opposition has really failed so far to engage big masses of people into their movement, which they have started in November 2020, and there is good reason for that. Their purpose was to use public pressure on the parliament and to get some 20 MPs resigned from the My Step faction, and then they would be able to set new elections and win there and so on. So I think they did not estimate the situation correctly first, because they thought they will have imposed enough pressure on the ruling party. It's on one side. On another side, if your goal is just technical, it's very hard to involve many people. And people felt that it's not about them, it's about politicians, and not very many people participated. Although there were many protest actions, rather frequent, but it was not due to the opposition. It had more to do with defeat in Artsakh war. It had more to do with discontent with government activities. So what opposition has done in many ways has favored the government. So I think as of now, this movement, which has started in November, has failed, and Pashinyan is effectively consolidating his power. He is accepting new and new laws and regularities, which, by the way, might make Armenia rather authoritarian. This is another risk. But coming to the opposition, I think this movement has failed, but it does not mean that Armenia's internal politics has stabilized, because losing Artsakh, or at least big part of Artsakh, we cannot expect that it might stabilize anytime soon.
Aspet, what do you think about the recent statements made by Ișhan Sagatalyan and 𝐊𝐶𝐭 Manukyan about their failures to convert the popular demand into a popular struggle to change the government?
I agree with Hrant. There's a lot of dimensions here about opposition and what kind of a setting they're operating in. We look at other previous opposition movements. They haven't managed to find that golden formula that can translate popular discontent to populist outing by the population. I think to a large extent, the opposition statement, it's just not inspiring. Everyone knows that there has been a problem. There is a challenge about the current government losing a war and losing it miserably. But at the end of the day, when you look at the alternative, people are not excited about it. If I'm not mistaken, Otto von Bismarck once had said that you don't change a horse in the middle of a battle. And that might also be the translation subconsciously in terms of at a crisis like this, which is dangerous, obviously, if you don't change the government. And as Hrant mentioned, there are tendencies that the power can be consolidated. But maybe subconsciously people realize that, with this messy situation, it is not the time to have drastic leadership change or government change. I think that's the reason why they haven't been able to shore up the support. Plus, all of these groups, they come with baggage. Rightfully or wrongfully so, they come with a baggage as to belonging to a regime that has been in power, the issues of corruption, the issues of opportunists, and so on and so forth, whether we agree with them or not. But there are some people who who view these opposition people separately or collectively as not to be a better alternative. So I think that's the major challenge of the opposition in terms of providing an alternative. And I do want to add one tiny thing here as well. I think the Moscow component is also important here. As long as Moscow is not sending signals that it is abandoning Pashinyan, that in itself can be translated by Pashinyan into political capital domestically. And I think Russia still needs Pashinyan as someone they can control ultimately and unconditionally. So they prefer to have someone like him stay in power for the foreseeable future until they get what they need.
In his interview, Robert Kocharian mentioned that if we do go to elections with the ruling party in charge of the executive branch, he said that the opposition should participate in the elections, and he specifically said that he himself would participate in the elections. Hrant, can you tell us what you think about this? How does this affect the overall political landscape in Armenia?
I think that Kocharian's will to participate in election also comes from his perception that he might win, and that he might get enough popular support, which I think is not a fact because of many things. One thing is that really he has some baggage and there is public discontent about his figure. Also, there is still some level of support to this government, approximately 40%. And also, it's important to note that government is using a big brainwashing machine, which uses fake accounts in social media, which uses anonymous YouTube and Telegram channels with very big traffic. So it affects public perceptions very strongly, and they are able to manipulate public opinion. And for example, one of the reasons, I completely agree with what has been said, but also one of the reasons why 𝐊𝐶𝐭 Manukyan failed was that he was not able to protect his image in people's mind. If you try to search on 𝐊𝐶𝐭 Manukyan in Armenian in YouTube, you will find numerous videos on how he has sold everything, how he is to blame in whatever you might imagine. The videos have very many views, and majority of cases they don't have any connection to the reality. So I think Kocharian does not really understand the reality on the political ground in Armenia, but also he perceives himself as a strong player which can solely play against the government and will try to win.
One thing that Hrant just mentioned, it made me realize that it seems that all the political actors in Armenia do not understand the political landscape in Armenia. I just wanted to add one tiny thing, if I may, Alan. It would be quite interesting to see 𝐀𝐬𝐿𝐴n's candidacy. How does that reflect on the current 17 plus opposition? Because the 17 plus, or 𝐊𝐨𝐭𝐜𝐬𝐿 said that they might, or the opposition was saying that they're not interested in running long term. They just wanted to become a transitional government. But now that 𝐀𝐬𝐿AN is throwing his hat in the ring in terms of participating in the election and hoping that he'll become prime minister for the next 5 years, it would be completely it would lead to complete disarray in the opposition. Some people, maybe the ARF might join him, support him in that thing. I'm not sure if the Republican Party might or might not, as surprisingly. Barka-Bachayastan might. So I think you see a duality or schism, maybe even in the anti-nickel camp, if you want to say it. I'm not calling it opposition camp, but in the anti-nickel camp.
Okay, turning our attention to Iran and its outreach to its neighbors in the north. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif started a tour last Sunday of Baku, Moscow, Yerevan, and finally Ankara. During the war in Artsakh, Iran was not very active, mostly guarding its borders against infiltration by terrorists. However, since the end of the war, they've become more involved and hope to have a say in how the region evolves. Asbet, can you talk about the drivers behind Iran's tour of the regional capitals? What are their goals and what are they trying to achieve?
It's quite interesting, and one of the things we were talking earlier before the podcast was that it's actually also visited Tbilisi, Georgia. So it is truly a regional visit. And also, if you would want to consider Nakhichevan as an autonomous region, he also visited Nakhichevan and dealt with the people there. I think Iran's message in general has been a couple of folds. First, it's about declaring respect of territorial integrity in Baku and in Nakhichevan, as well as in Yerevan. The same message, sending it out there that Iran respects and is adamant to keep the territorial integrity of the countries. With Georgia, it was more of a working visit with a couple of issues they had. But I think Iran is trying to be more active this time around as compared to 1994, mostly because of the fact that the United States and the West are not involved. Because if some of you remember, back in 1994, Iran, while trying to become a player, while trying to become a mediator in the region, it was blocked especially by the US. And as we saw in the last 4 years, the US has been completely disengaged from the region, and there are no strong indicators that it will be coming back forcefully. This is an opportunity for Iran to be considered a more important player along with Russia and Turkey as partners. And I don't consider these three countries to be rivals, and Iran's policies have always been conciliatory rather than confrontational. So I think it can diminish, it can soften the bipolarity, if you want to call it, which I don't think there is Russian-Turkish two poles, into a more milder tripolar system.
Hrant, what sort of influence can they have now on the new regional state of affairs?
Well, I agree with what Asbet said, but I also want to add several points on Iran's approach. I think they have realized that they have missed a lot of things. They have missed how the security and foreign politics was developing in the South Caucasus region, and they found themselves in the situation which is changing very quickly, and not in the way which is completely in favor of Iran, to not say the opposite. So now Iran tries to figure out its place in the new region, and as Aliyev and Erdogan have said, the geopolitics of region have changed, and it's really the case. So now I think Iran just tries to find its place here. And also they have sent several messages, one of which is that territorial integrity of Armenia is a red line for Iran, which means that Iran values common border with Armenia, which is now under threat, obviously. So it is sending the message that it is ready to involve in the region more actively than before. I think it's not only Iran which was not able to find its place in the region during the last 30 years, but also the regional countries also were not able to find Iran's place in this whole picture. And it depends on Iran itself, because Iran has to prepare some offer to the countries, but also on the countries. Now Iran is trying to send some messages. I'm sure there were some negotiations which were not publicly available, of course. So I think in some future it will be more clear which results the visit had, because we can judge only from what has been publicly discussed. But I think Iran tries to find its place in the new region.
Hrant, is part of the complexity due to Iran's need to calculate the reaction of the US and Israel to any moves it makes?
Well, of course, from one point of view, yes, but on another point of view, it's even more important, I think, that Iran's bordering territory has switched, let's say, de facto owner, which affects Iran's internal politics as well, because if you could see the footage from the place when Azerbaijani forces have reached, for example, Hudaferdin Bridge, there were Iranian Azerbaijanis to meet them from Iranian side. They were welcoming them. The whole war has affected public opinion in northern Iran, and Iranian Azerbaijanis now feel like, let's say, some kind of national revival. They feel more connection to Azerbaijan, and it is also important for Iran. Concerning United States and Israel relation to Iran and to this region, for me it's a bit harder to say, although we see instability in Iran which could be connected to this rivalry. I mean, energy sector, the death of one of the most important
nuclear
figures
scientists
in Iranian nuclear program. Yeah, that might also be a case, but if we look just on this region, it's still very important for Iran.
By the way, it's interesting that in Zarif's visit to Georgia and in 𝐀𝐬𝐻𝐿, at least what was announced or what was public, focused on trade. Meaning, in the case of Georgia, it was about discussions allowing Iranian truck drivers to go through the territory, Georgian territory, and in 𝐀𝐬𝐻𝐿, it was about increasing economic activity with 𝐀𝐬𝐻𝐿 via Armenia and Iran. So I think it's multilateral, right? It's not just about the political, geopolitical, but also about trying to carve up part of the economic pie.
Hrant, we've had a tradition to look at the state of the coronavirus pandemic in Armenia when you're with us on our podcast. I've been going through a bunch of numbers, but let me quickly summarize at a high level. In October, we were looking at what looked to be a catastrophic situation. We were running over 5,500 COVID tests a day, and we had nearly a 50% infection rate with 24 to 2,500 infections per day and 20, 30, sometimes 40 deaths per day. In November, we were testing in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. Infection rates had fallen to 40%, around 1,500 infections per day. In December, we started testing less, 2,500 to 3,000, and it looked like the infection rate again dipped, and we had 600 to 1,000, so maybe 33% rate. And now in January, this is the interesting thing, in January we're testing barely 2,000 a day, and the infection rate has dipped to 5 to 10%, like we are seeing 100 to 250 infections per day. What do you make of this? Because in the US, we botched the pandemic management as well, and we've seen a 33% drop in the daily infection rate here in January, but it's nowhere as deep as in Armenia. What do you think?
I'm also making calculations on the rate of spread of coronavirus and excess deaths in Armenia, and I think that calling it catastrophic in October to November is a correct estimation, because in 2020 we had about 7,000 excess deaths not connected to the war, out of which about a half were registered, but the rest were not even registered, and non-registered deaths occurred just in times of peak of the virus, when the healthcare system was not able to provide everyone who was in need with the hospital beds. Now, concerning the spread of the virus, we see clearly that it's on its decline. Now we have 141 cases in average daily during last week, with 1,680 tests a day in one week, as you said, and number of deaths has decreased. So I think now it's in more or less stable situation, and it's still on decline. One of the reasons for this decline is the decline started with war, because during the war social activity in Armenia has sharply decreased. Also, there were some measures to decrease social activity, for example, study in schools and so on. Another reason is New Year celebration, which in Armenia is traditionally long-lasting, and people again decrease their social activity. But bigger reason is that horizontal social mobility in Armenia is also very low, and the virus spread mostly in Yerevan. So when Yerevan has achieved some level of collective immunity, not enough for full stop of spread of the virus, but enough for decrease of its spread, the wave has decreased, the second wave. So I think now it's more or less stable situation with it, but we can never be sure what will happen in the future.
Do you think this is because Armenia is doing something right and so it's turned a corner on the pandemic? Or is this a seasonal dip? Or is the infection rate slowing because the overall level of infection has become so high? If we take the total number of cases, the official count is roughly 167,000, and if we quadruple it for safety, then we're over 650,000 people, which is roughly a community infection level of 20 to 23%. So it's not even a third of the required 70% for herd immunity.
Well, my calculation shows that we have about 726,000 cases in reality, while we had 167,000 cases registered. So yes, about 4 times more. But another thing is that if we distinguish it by regions, it might be that in Yerevan it's more, maybe up to 40% of population. And herd immunity is not very stable number. It also depends on rate of spread of the virus. While rate of spread of the virus depends on social activity. That's why I mentioned it. If the social activity is low, if you don't have, for example, football matches or, I don't know, the events which involve many people in one place, the rate of spread of the virus will decline. And if the rate of spread of the virus has declined, then you might achieve herd immunity much faster. At least timely, for some time. Maybe after it, if social activity again increases, you might get another wave, third wave, I don't know. But as of now, with this level of social activity, you can predict that second wave is more or less over.
And also, don't forget the climate, the weather also is a factor, right? You know, we're witnessing, especially in Yerevan, when it's usually foggy, it's cold, you see less people outside. But I myself, actually, while getting out of Yerevan, I did see in some regions, in some cities, towns, and so on, a huge congregation of people. Now, without masks, obviously. But in Yerevan, again, depending on the weather, depending on the climate, you have less interaction, even on the streets or at cafes or in, public spaces. So this is also one of the components. I think we have to always brace ourselves for the spring, how things will develop up until then.
I wanted to briefly turn our attention to the vaccine and vaccination process. Armenia is getting the Sputnik V Russian vaccine as well as the AstraZeneca vaccine. Do you know how these are being worked out, who's paying for them, and the plans for the vaccination process? Hrant?
I knew only about British vaccine, which was bought in very little numbers by the state. If I'm not mistaken, they bought 3,000 portions. But what's with Sputnik and what are the more recent news, to be frank, I don't know.
And don't forget, actually, one of the things is that with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there's a huge problem in Europe now with the supply line. So that could also have an impact on the supply in Armenia. By the way, Hrant, I don't know if you came across this or not, but a couple of days ago there were some conversations, and these were not necessarily rumor mills, that Moderna's owner, Nubar was visiting Armenia and he might be donating 300,000 vaccines to the country. I don't know if you've heard or have any more concrete details about that.
No, to be frank, I don't know the details. Hopefully Armenia will get some vaccine, but I don't know exactly.
Nubar Afeyan was also on Lebanese TV because they were interested in his background as a Lebanese Armenian. One of the interesting things that he had mentioned is how tightly the supply of vaccines is being controlled by the governments right now, because there's such a there's a shortage, and so every government wants to basically be first in line.
Right.
Okay, moving on. Hrant, during the war in Artsakh and shortly after the ceasefire agreement during the telethon in November, the Hayastan All-Armenian Fund collected over $200 million, of which reportedly around 100 to 105 million were sent to the Armenian government, which put them in its general budget as part of its revenues, to be used for social, healthcare, and infrastructure expenditures. A recent report said that around 50 million of these funds were used to stabilize the Dram, with the Central Bank of Armenia using them to actively intervene in the financial markets to keep the Dram exchange rate stable. Back when you were in our podcast in October and then again in November, we had discussed that using the Hayastan All-Armenia Fund funds to support the Dram would make sense to keep the Armenian economy functioning normally and the financial sector from collapsing due to, pandemic, slowing economy, etc. What are your thoughts on how these funds are helping on the macro scale?
If we look at Dram exchange rate, we can see that there is no panic anymore, at least as of now. So at least in some part, it played its role if it was really invested in stabilizing Armenian Dram. Now, I'm not sure spending donated money, central bank interventions, is a good idea. Although financial system of Armenia has stabilized, Armenian Dram rate has stabilized, and it also has prevented the panic. So in this way, it helped Armenia to stabilize the financial situation in the country. So I think if people have donated money to be spent on Artsakh, on refugees, on social expenses, I think it's better to spend them on that. And maybe government could decrease its spendings on this in this field, but anyway, for ensuring trust in public institutions, for ensuring a better connection to the diaspora, I think it's better to keep the funds to the direction which has been chosen by the people.
I think one of the components here as post-war situation where you have mistrust or less trust in the Armenian currency, hence a lot of people were buying dollars or euros. But at the same time, when you look at the real estate market shooting up in prices, all of these, actually the government now is trying to at least stabilize things economically ahead of the upcoming elections so that they can actually say that, listen, we managed to stop the Armenian Dram from a free fall. So definitely it has the political component here, and the government will try its best to stabilize the Dram, not to devaluate it. But I, not being an economist, but just observing, I am a bit concerned about the latent effect of the war and the latent effect of COVID hitting the economy quite hard. The question would be, is there a plan by the government towards this, preventing it or not? But at the end of the day, I think it is about dealing with those issues such as the social issues, but also stabilizing the economy as an electoral tactic by the current government.
I think it's better to have more data, to have stronger arguments on that. I'll wait for new data before we could go deeper into this topic.
Just agreeing with Hrant, I think it's still an ongoing process, an ongoing development.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We are going to call it a day.
Thank you, Asbed.
Thank you.
Alan.
Thank you.
Hrant.
Thank you.
That concludes our program for this Week in Review episode. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from the previous week. We look forward to your feedback and your suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.